November 18th, 1995. Vicksburg, Mississippi. 62-year-old Jacqueline Levitz, the wealthy widowed heiress to a furniture empire, vanishes from her home. Her bedroom contains bloodstains and signs of a violent struggle, making it likely that Jacqueline met with foul play. Numerous suspects would be investigated, including Jacqueline's son, her recently deceased husband's family, and a mother and son con artist duo who would be convicted of the murder of another wealthy missing woman years later. However, no evidence connects anyone to the crime, and Jacqueline Levitz is never found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we will be covering another missing persons case, the 1995 disappearance of Jacqueline Levitz. As you probably know, we released our 100th episode last week, which covered the infamous unsolved disappearance of millionaire Canadian theater tycoon Ambrose Small, whose wife Teresa inherited his estate and was considered a potential suspect. So this week, I'm going to cover a similar story from the modern era, only this time it's about a woman who inherited a sizable fortune from her husband after he passed away and then went missing several months later. The case was originally suggested to me sometime last year by a listener named Tally, and this seemed like an appropriate time to cover it, so thank you very much for the suggestion, Tally. On the surface, it seems like a case which should be solvable. A wealthy woman moves into a new town after inheriting her husband's estate, and within weeks, she vanishes from her home, and there's a lot of physical evidence to show she was violently attacked. Given the circumstances, you'd assume that Jacqueline was targeted because of her money, but it seems like this crime was not financially motivated and a lot more personal in nature. There are a lot of potential suspects, but thus far, no one has ever been linked to the crime, so in this episode, we'll do our best to try and figure out the most likely scenario for what happened to her. But before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. And in case you haven't heard, The Trail Went Cold is finally on Patreon, and we are overwhelmed by the number of supporters who have already decided to sign up. So if you would like to support the podcast, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold, and for as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards from yours truly, early access to episodes, and bonus content. I've already delivered shoutouts to many of our patrons, and will be thanking 20 more of you folks near the end of this episode. So with all that out of the way, let us now examine the unsolved disappearance of Jacqueline Levitz. Our story begins in Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1995. Our central figure is 62-year-old Mary Jacqueline Levitz, who goes by the name Jackie. Jackie was born in Oak Grove, Louisiana as Mary Jacqueline Broadway and grew up on a cotton farm as one of 9 children in a family of poor sharecroppers. However, in spite of her background, Jackie had a true rags-to-riches story as she went on to have a successful career in real estate, amassing a $4 million fortune by buying, renovating, and selling houses. Jackie's first marriage occurred during the late 1950s and ended in a divorce a few years later, but it was here that she had her only son, Walter. She later remarried another man named Bank Smith, who died of a heart attack in 1969. In 1987, Jackie married her third husband, Ralph Levitz, who was over 20 years older than her and the millionaire head of the Levitz furniture empire. The Levitz family had owned a furniture store in Pennsylvania for several decades, but during the 1960s, Ralph and his brother decided to expand Levitz Furniture into a nationwide chain and made a fortune after pioneering the idea of the warehouse-style furniture store. By the time he met Jackie, Ralph had already been through 5 marriages, had one son named Philip, and was comfortably retired in Palm Beach, Florida. After marrying Ralph, Jackie would become a very prominent socialite among the wealthy elite in the Palm Beach area, but the marriage came to an end in March of 1995 when Ralph suffered a fatal stroke at the age of 82. As a result, Jackie wound up inheriting her husband's estate, which was worth around $15 million. However, by this point, Jackie had grown tired of her luxurious lifestyle and wanted to, quote-unquote, get back to her roots. So she decided to move to the town of Vicksburg as it bordered the Mississippi-Louisiana state line and allowed Jackie to live a relatively close distance from many of her family members. She purchased a 2,900 square foot, 3-bedroom home located on a bluff overlooking the Mississippi River. The house was in close proximity to the Vicksburg Bridge, which could be used to cross over the river into Louisiana. Jackie then hired a construction crew of around 40 workmen to perform an extensive remodeling job on her house, as she hoped to expand it into a 7,000 square foot, 7-bedroom home and planned to use it for a huge family get-together that Christmas. At around 4:30 p.m. on Saturday, November 18th, only 5 weeks after she arrived in Vicksburg, Jackie went to a local store to purchase wallpaper for her home, but this would turn out to be the last time she was seen alive. For the next 2 days, Jackie never answered her phone, so one of her sisters, Tiki Shivers, became concerned and asked her husband, James Earl Shivers, if he would go visit Jackie's house to check on her. When James arrived, he noticed that Jackie's unlocked Jaguar convertible was still in the driveway, but there was no answer at the front door. Since the door was unlocked, James entered the house, walked to Jackie's bedroom, and was treated to a disturbing sight. It looked like a violent struggle had taken place inside the room, as there was a large blood spot on the carpet, damage to the closet door, and the tips of Jackie's fake fingernails were scattered on the floor. The police were immediately notified, and when they arrived at the scene, they examined Jackie's bed. They discovered that her sheets were missing, and that the mattress was completely soaked in blood. Someone had turned the mattress over in an attempt to conceal the bloodstains. Testing would later reveal that it matched Jackie's blood type, so it seemed very likely that she had become a victim of foul play. The large amount of blood made investigators speculate that her throat may have been cut. A glass of water and a pair of Jackie's diamond earrings were resting on the window seat. There was also a small television set perched next to the window ledge, which had been left on, and a chair was positioned in front of it. Since Jackie often liked to relax by sitting by the window and staring at the Mississippi River, this seemed to indicate she was doing just that before someone attacked her. Strangely, it seemed like robbery might not have been the motive. The only items which appeared to be missing from the house were Jackie's purse and makeup bag, but hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of fur coats were left behind in the closet, and a safe containing $500,000 worth of jewelry was unopened. The diamond earrings left on the window seat were also worth $3,000 on their own. Due to the remodeling, the only pieces of furniture inside the house at the time were plastic lawn chairs. One lead was provided by the son of one of Jackie's neighbors, who was visiting from out of town, and went outside to smoke a cigarette and walk his dog sometime between 10 and 11 p.m. on the evening of November 18th. He claimed that he heard the sound of a vehicle starting near the Levitz home. There were faint tire tracks found on the lawn, which suggested someone may have backed up a vehicle to the front door in order to remove Jackie's body from the house. Anyway, investigators started looking at potential suspects. Even though Jackie had inherited her husband's $15 million estate, she already had a $4 million estate of her own, which she had amassed through her real estate work. Jackie's son Walter stood to inherit her estate, but he was determined to be over 1,000 miles away in Maryland at the time she went missing and ruled out as a suspect. Now, in the event of Jackie's death, Ralph Levitz's estate would be placed in a trust fund and divided up among Ralph's 2 grandchildren, who belonged to Philip Levitz, his son from a previous marriage. However, no evidence was ever found to connect anyone from the Levitz family to Jackie's disappearance, and since her body was nowhere to be found, it would be at least 5 years before anyone could begin the process of declaring her legally dead and dispersing her estate. The focus of the investigation would swing towards the construction crew who were working on Jackie's home at the time she went missing. Since there were no signs of any forced entry into the house, it was theorized that the perpetrator might have sneaked inside through the attic, which was under construction. Around 40 contractors had done work for Jackie, and she had even fired a couple of them from the crew prior to her disappearance. Some of the workmen were drifters, and at least one of them had a prior conviction for burglary. While interviewing one of the contractors, investigators noticed a prominent scratch on his face, but he was able to convince them that he had gotten the scratch in an unrelated fight and provided a credible alibi. Overall, the construction crew was very cooperative with police, and none of them were considered serious suspects. Employees from the store where Jackie was last seen purchasing wallpaper provided a potentially interesting lead. 1 week before she vanished, they remembered seeing Jackie arrive at the store with a man in a pickup truck before she went inside and purchased a barbecue grill. This man was never identified, and no one had any idea who he might be. As you'll recall, Jackie had only been in Vicksburg 5 weeks, and while she had made friends with some of her neighbors, she had not done much socializing with the local residents, as the majority of her time was spent on her home renovations. In fact, most people in the community claimed they had no idea a wealthy furniture heiress had taken residence there until after her disappearance made headlines. One of the most prominent theories was that Jackie was the victim of a botched ransom kidnapping, which didn't go as planned and ended in her death. Since her house was in such close proximity to the Mississippi River, whoever was responsible might have disposed of her body there. Searches of the river turned up no trace of Jackie, but it was possible that the strong currents could have carried her body into the Gulf of Mexico. The investigation eventually hit a standstill, until the authorities looked into the possibility that Jackie's disappearance might be connected to another missing persons case involving a wealthy woman. On July 5, 1998, 82-year-old Irene Silverman vanished from her $7 million mansion in Manhattan. Irene had a number of apartments in her mansion, which she often rented out to tenants, and it wasn't long until the investigation led to 23-year-old Kenny Kimes, who had moved into one of these apartments less than a month before Irene went missing. Kenny and his 64-year-old mother, Sante Kimes, were a con artist duo who often perpetrated elaborate scams against wealthy victims. Now, the story of Sante and Kenny Kimes is a pretty crazy one, and you can find other true crime podcasts who have done entire episodes about their case, but here are the basics. It would turn out the Kimeses had schemed to get rid of Irene Silverman and have Sante take over her identity so they could move into her expensive mansion. But even though Irene's body was never found, Sante and Kenny were both charged with her murder in December of 1998. While there wasn't any physical evidence of foul play, the Kimeses had still left quite a paper trail which pointed to their guilt, including detailed notebooks in which Sante outlined her plan to take over Irene's identity. As a result, they were both found guilty at trial, not only of murder, but of 117 other charges. Kenny was sentenced to 125 years in prison, while Sante received 120 years. It wasn't long before the Kimeses were linked to and charged with the shooting death of a Los Angeles businessman named David Kasdan, who was murdered in March of 1998 after discovering that the Kimeses had forged a signature on a loan application. They would both receive additional sentences of life imprisonment for the Kasdan murder, and Kenny would finally confess to killing Irene Silverman, claiming that at his mother's behest, he strangled Irene to death and disposed of her body somewhere in New Jersey, though it has never been recovered. Kenny also confessed to them murdering a wealthy banker in the Bahamas in 1996 named Syed Balil Ahmed, but no charges were ever filed in that case. Anyway, Sante died in prison in 2014, and Kenny is still incarcerated today. Anyway, given their history of preying on wealthy victims, investigators looked into the possibility that the Kimeses may have been responsible for Jacqueline Levitz's disappearance. However, even though Sante had kept detailed notebooks about her scheme against Irene Silverman, no mention of Jackie's name could be found in any of the evidence seized after the Kimeses' arrests, so there was nothing to connect them to this case. In 2001, at the request of her family, the courts legally declared Jackie dead. Jackie's $4 million estate was inherited by her son Walter, who would become co-executor alongside Jackie's sister, Tiki. Per the original arrangement, the $15 million estate Jackie had inherited from her husband was placed in a trust fund for Ralph Levitz's 2 grandchildren. Walter passed away in 2006, so Jackie's assets would be dispersed to other beneficiaries. But after 22 years, there are still no answers about who was actually responsible for Jackie's disappearance. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Yes, this is definitely a baffling case with a number of potential theories about what might have happened, but none of them make complete sense. The blood evidence definitely shows that Jackie was probably murdered inside her home and someone disposed of her body, but what we don't know is who did it and why. Like I mentioned in the intro, you can draw some parallels between this case and my episode last week about the disappearance of Ambrose Small, as both cases involve people going missing not long after they came into a large amount of money. Of course, the key difference is that Ambrose went missing the very day after he closed a $1.7 million deal, while Jackie's disappearance took place several months after she inherited a fortune, and since it took place after she moved to an entirely different state, that only makes the motive more confusing. Another key difference is that Ambrose was a very unethical man who screwed a lot of people over in his life and made a number of potential enemies, but for the most part, Jackie seemed to be a very well-liked person who was known for her kindness and generosity. Even though she was rich, it seemed like Jackie never forgot her roots, and the fact that she had to work her way up from a poor farming family. Yes, Jackie married a wealthy husband who was 20 years her senior, but she had already amassed her own fortune before they even met, so I definitely wouldn't call her a gold digger. In fact, not long after they got married, Ralph suffered a stroke which left him partially disabled, and his condition only worsened over the next few years until he died in 1995. Because of his initial stroke, Jackie had to devote a lot of energy to taking care of Ralph during the majority of their marriage, so it seems like she truly loved him and did not just marry him for his money. Jackie seemed to be pretty tired of being a member of the wealthy elite in Palm Beach, which would explain her decision to move to a more down-to-earth town in Mississippi where she could be closer to her family. Even though Ralph's death had left her an additional $15 million fortune, she was essentially downgrading her luxury lifestyle. At the time of her disappearance, Jackie had nothing in her new house but some plastic furniture, and according to her family and friends, she described the experience as being like camping, and she really seemed to get a kick out of living like that. However, once Jackie's disappearance made the news, there was at least one person who painted a much different picture of Jackie as a person. An article published in the January 13, 1996 edition of the Palm Beach Post featured an interview with Ann Pellegrino, the daughter of Jackie's second husband, Bank Smith, who went by the nickname Smitty. Smitty's children were from a previous marriage, and it sounds like they didn't think too highly of Jackie. Smitty died of a heart attack in 1969 at the age of 46, and according to his family, when he first started suffering from chest pains and asked Jackie to drive him to the hospital, she took a deliberately long time to get there, stopping at a bank to withdraw cash, and then traveling to a hospital an hour away instead of someplace much closer. Apparently, Smitty was so shaken by the incident that he told relatives in his hospital room that he was preparing divorce papers for Jackie, but he succumbed to heart failure before this could happen. For the next few years, Jackie would be engaged in legal battles with Smitty's children over his will, and they all thought she was a cold, calculating woman. While Jackie's family was quick to denounce Ann Pellegrino's claims as absurd, and said she was most definitely not the cold, calculating woman that Smitty's children painted her to be. I have no idea what the real truth is, but I've pondered if perhaps this story had any bearing on what happened to Jackie. Perhaps someone on Smitty's side of the family still held a massive grudge against Jackie over his death, and after learning that her third husband had died, and that she'd inherited a $15 million fortune, they decided to travel to Vicksburg and murder her. But given that over 25 years had passed since Smitty's death by this point, I find that theory to be a major stretch. Yet even though Jackie seemed to be very well liked overall, this still makes me wonder what kind of enemies she may have had. But before we delve into this any further, let's talk about who would have benefited from Jackie's death. If you research this case online, you'll find a couple of internet message board threads about this case, which discuss rumors about Jackie being the victim of a contract hit. Of course, her son Walter was the beneficiary of her $4 million estate, and even though he had an airtight alibi placing him in another state at the time his mother went missing, I guess you have to examine the possibility that he could have hired someone to kill her. And then of course there's the fact that Jackie inherited Ralph's estate after he passed away, even though he had a son from a previous marriage, and 2 children who would have a trust fund set up for them if anything ever happened to Jackie. So you could see why someone from Ralph's side of the family would have motive to kill her. However, there's one primary reason why I don't believe Jackie's disappearance had anything to do with her estate. Her body was never found. Even though the evidence at the scene made it pretty obvious that Jackie had been murdered, there was no body, and without it, there would be a mandatory waiting period of at least 5 years before she could be declared legally dead and anyone was entitled to inherit her estate. Meaning that if someone had Jackie murdered for her money, they arranged things so that it would be years before they actually received any. It just seems to me that if Jackie's inheritance was the motive for this crime, then her body would have been left behind in the house to ensure there was no doubt she was dead. I do know that the Northern Trust Bank of Florida did lobby to declare Jackie dead as early as 1997 so that the assets she inherited from Ralph could be divided up among his grandchildren, but her sister Tiki fought this action and it was later dropped. Even so, if the motive was financial gain, there would still be no reason to dispose of Jackie's body. Regardless, investigators failed to turn up any evidence that Walter or anyone from Jackie or Ralph's families were responsible for what happened to her, though there is a bit of an interesting postscript to this story. If you search online, you'll find a pair of interesting legal appeals for the case Estate of Levitz versus Broadway. It turned out that in April of 1995, Jackie lent $70,000 to 2 of her brothers, Joe and Don Broadway, in order for them to purchase property in Arkansas. They executed a promissory note which stated that in May of 1997, Joe and Don would start repaying the money to their sister in installments over a 10-year period, and that the title to the property would be transferred to Jackie if the loans were not paid. Of course, Jackie went missing before this payment plan could go into effect, but the original promissory note was still found in her possessions. Well, after Jackie was declared dead, and her sister Tiki became administrator of her estate, she believed that the promissory note entitled her to collect the $70,000 loan which was paid to their brothers, or else obtain title to their property in Arkansas, so she filed suit against them. Well, the family went to court, where it was ruled that Joe and Don had no obligation to pay back the $70,000 debt to Tiki. Multiple witnesses backed up the 2 brothers' claims that Jackie had told them she was forgiving the debt and was no longer expecting them to pay it, but she just never got around to destroying the promissory note before she disappeared. I guess in the back of my mind, I wondered if perhaps the 2 brothers might have gotten rid of Jackie in order to avoid paying back their debt, but the story about her forgiving the debt did check out, and the court's ruling in their favor held up on appeal, so I have no reason to believe they're not telling the truth. Whatever the motive was for Jackie's disappearance, I just don't believe it was financial. The one aspect of this case which has always baffled investigators is the perpetrator going to the trouble of disposing her body. There just doesn't seem to be any logical reason for them to do that, regardless of motive. Generally, when people attempt to conceal bodies of their murder victims, they do so to cover their tracks and give off the false impression that perhaps the victim disappeared on their own and there was no foul play. But here, there was blood all over Jackie's bedroom, her false fingernail tips were on the floor, and the only attempt to conceal anything was by turning the blood-soaked mattress over. The perpetrator did not attempt to clean up the scene and cover up evidence that a crime had taken place, so it just seems kind of redundant to get rid of her body. I mean, I guess they might have wanted to dispose of potential forensic evidence, but this was 1995, when DNA profiling was still a relatively new thing. Given the amount of blood in the bedroom, along with the presence of the diamond earrings and the glass of water on the window seat and the TV being left on, I do think it's very likely that Jackie was attacked inside her bedroom and murdered there instead of being abducted. The fact that the tire tracks were found in the yard and a witness heard the sound of a car starting up on the night of Jackie's disappearance leads me to believe that someone backed the vehicle up to the house in order to place her dead body inside before they drove away. Another strange aspect of this case is Jackie having only been in Vicksburg for 5 weeks before she went missing. She had only become acquainted with a handful of people in the town, mostly her neighbors, and they all seemed to really like her, so it doesn't sound like she was there long enough to develop any major enemies. Even though Levitz Furniture was a pretty well-known company in the US at that time, most of the local residents claimed they didn't even know who she was, or that she was an heiress to the company's fortune. However, it is easy to see why a wealthy, glamorous-looking woman like Jackie might be a target for someone who saw her arrive into town. The house she was moving into wasn't exactly a mansion, but it was relatively pricey, and a construction crew was working on the place to make it bigger, so she could have drawn the attention of someone who figured out she had money. In fact, only a few weeks after Jackie's disappearance, a pair of young men were arrested after attempting to burglarize her empty house, though they were cleared of any involvement in her disappearance. But the problem is that even though Jackie hadn't moved much furniture into her house, there were still quite a few valuables which were left behind, such as fur coats and a safe containing jewelry. Hell, her $3,000 diamond earrings were left right out there in the open. Even if robbery was not the motive for this crime, why not be an opportunist and just take what's up for grabs? It's been theorized that Jackie's disappearance may have been the result of a botched ransom kidnapping, but if so, why not at least take some of the valuables so you don't come away from the whole thing empty-handed? So I suppose this would be a good time to address Sante and Kenny Kimes and their potential involvement in this crime. While I honestly have zero reason to suspect they had anything to do with what happened to Jackie, yes, there are a few parallels between Jackie's case and the disappearance of Irene Silverman, as they were both wealthy women living alone who turned up missing, but there really isn't anything to link this case to the Kimeses at all. The Kimeses were not just criminals who broke into rich people's homes and murdered them. They were cold, calculating con artists who devised elaborate plans where they slowly gained their victims' trust and exploited them for monetary gain. If the victim became suspicious or outlived their usefulness, that's when the Kimes would murder them. I see no indication that anything like this occurred with Jackie. I could see her being a potential target for the duo while she was living in a $3 million mansion in Palm Beach, Florida, but she had just completely uprooted her life to move to Vicksburg and had only been there 5 weeks before she went missing. I just don't see the Kimeses targeting a woman living in a house in Mississippi which was under construction and had no furniture. And the main reason the Kimeses were convicted of Irene Silverman's murder without a body or physical evidence is because Sante liked to keep detailed notes about all her plans, but investigators couldn't find any mention of Jacqueline Levitz in her notes at all. And one thing's for certain, if they murdered Jackie, I seriously doubt Sante and Kenny would have left behind the diamond earrings, fur coats, and all the valuables inside Jackie's house. They ain't gonna go to that type of trouble for no financial gain. So while Sante and Kenny Kimes are awful human beings who are definitely responsible for multiple murders, I don't think they committed this one. But who could have been responsible? I know the large amount of blood found on the mattress made investigators suspect that Jackie's throat had been slashed, which seems to indicate that this crime was personal in nature. Given that around 40 contractors had worked on Jackie's house before she vanished, one of the most prominent theories is that one of the workmen could have been responsible for what happened. And it's certainly a very plausible scenario. It sounds like Jackie was a very warm and friendly host to the contractors while they were working on the house, constantly bringing them food and refreshments, so one of them could have easily developed a fixation on her. Everyone on that crew would have known Jackie was living alone in a house which was under construction, meaning that it was not 100% secure, and she was very vulnerable. Since there were no noticeable signs of a break-in, investigators theorized that the perpetrator could have entered the house through the attic while Jackie was in town buying wallpaper, and may have already been inside waiting for her when she arrived at home. November 18th was a Saturday, so you'd have to assume that the construction crew had the weekend off, and any of those workmen would have known she'd be alone that day. It's possible that the perpetrator did not intentionally plan on killing Jackie and was only intending to sexually assault her inside her bedroom, but when she fought back, he wound up killing her in a violent fashion, which left a lot of blood behind. It sounds like there were workmen from that crew who seemed like promising suspects, as a couple of them had been fired, some of them were drifters, at least one of them had a criminal record for burglary, and another one was found with a scratch on his face. But in the end, it seems like most of these contractors were ruled out, and investigators could not find any suspects from the crew who could be linked to the crime. While I do believe that the theory about one of the contractors being responsible is a very solid one, it doesn't sound like police found any evidence to support this, so it pretty much puts us back at square one. However, there is the eyewitness sighting of Jackie being dropped off at a store by a man in a pickup truck 1 week before her disappearance. The most logical explanation is that this man was a member of the construction crew, but as far as I can tell, he was never conclusively identified. Given the limited interaction Jackie had with residents from the Vicksburg area, who could this man have been? It's possible the eyewitnesses from the store were mistaken about what they saw, or that the guy in the pickup truck is nothing but a red herring, though I guess an alternate explanation is that Jackie got romantically involved with someone who ultimately killed her, but no one ever found out about it. Yet the evidence from the bedroom seems to suggest that Jackie was taken by surprise and attacked by an intruder, which goes against the idea that her killer was someone she was intimate with. There's one more potential theory I've seen thrown around. Only 1 month before Jackie's disappearance, Levitz Furniture found itself in some financial trouble when a deal in which Montgomery Ward planned to buy 20% of the company fell apart, causing its stock to drop 22%. Over the course of the year, declining sales had forced the company to cut 1,000 jobs. Levitz Furniture would be forced to declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 1997, and it eventually liquidated all its stores and went out of business for good 11 years later. Given that Jackie was the heiress to the Levitz Furniture empire, could the perpetrator have been a disgruntled former employee, or someone who decided to take out their wrath on her because of the company's financial problems? Anything's possible, but Ralph Levitz had been retired since 1983, and neither he nor Jackie had any say in what was going on with the company. Yes, it did make news when Ralph passed away in March of 1995, and Jackie inherited his estate, but would this have really compelled someone to follow Jackie all the way to Mississippi and murder her over company problems she had nothing to do with? That seems highly unlikely, but none of the theories make 100% complete sense. Overall, I'm inclined to think the solution is not overly complicated. This was probably not a contract hit or anything to do with Jackie's estate, but just a tragic case of a woman being murdered by someone who may have developed a fixation on her. For all we know, this could have been a person who set their eyes on Jackie when she arrived in town, but never actually met or interacted with her, which is why they've never shown up on the radar as a suspect. Jackie was a glamorous-looking woman who definitely stood out in a crowd, so it's easy to see why she may have been targeted. I think the theory about a random predator breaking into Jackie's house to attack and murder her before disposing of her body is probably the correct one. I know investigators checked into the construction crew, but I can't help but wonder if there was someone on that crew who slipped through the cracks. This contractor could have been a drifter who was only on the crew for a short time, but left town immediately following the murder, so they were never thoroughly investigated. Whoever it was, I have a feeling they did not live in Vicksburg, and given that Jackie was not reported missing for 2 days, this person might have skipped town and been long gone before the police even got involved. Whatever the case, even though the perpetrator or perpetrators left behind a ton of evidence to indicate Jackie had been murdered, they didn't leave any clues to their identity, and they've managed to get away with it for over 20 years. I have a feeling that Jackie's body was put into the Mississippi River, and the currents took it to an area where it will never be recovered, but even if her family cannot give her a proper burial, they deserve to see her killer brought to justice. So if you happen to have any information on the unsolved disappearance of Jacqueline Levitz, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Anyway, like I mentioned earlier, The Trail Went Cold has just been launched on Patreon. So if you have a moment, please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat exclusive bonus rewards. So I would like to send out a special thanks to 20 more of our listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon since we launched there a few weeks ago. Since it's been taking us a while to catch up to everyone, I've been thanking our patrons in increments of 20, so if you've signed up and haven't heard your name yet, not to worry, you will receive acknowledgement on another episode in the near future. Anyway, this week, I'd like to send shoutouts to Jasoyo, Keisha R., Kat, Aaron P., Stacy R., Boots Callahan, Ricky T., Andrea C., Jen J., Jason M., Brenda L., Andrea C., Stephanie S., Caitlin K., Jessica Y., Carolyn M., The Britner, Brett, and Regina R. Thank you so much for your support. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. And we also have a Facebook discussion group if you would like to discuss these cases or true crime in general with myself and your fellow listeners. Anyway, in just over a week from now, I'm going to be attending CrimeCon in Nashville, Tennessee, which means that next week's episode is going to be a mystery from Nashville. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a special CrimeCon themed episode of The Trail Went Cold. Bye.